So I've had quite a few young men ask me lately, how do you know when you've become a man? I mean, what changes? Is there something internally or externally that changes so you know that you're no longer a boy anymore? Well, for many people that happens gradually, but for some people, they do recognize that something has changed inside them and that they feel they've stepped over that threshold into manhood. And it's a great question that they asked me, so I decided to do a video on it. So I'm just going to read you a couple of stories about what changed for a couple of guys, and also talk to you about what happened to me so that I knew that the boy in me was no longer there. Welcome back to Maps to Manhood. So let's start the first one. So I was 20 years old when I went on a weekend hiking trip with 3 friends. The plan was simple: 2 days in the mountains, a night camping, and then home on Sunday afternoon. On the second day, things went wrong. One of my friends slipped while crossing a rocky section of trail and badly injured his ankle. He couldn't put any weight on it. We were several kilometers from the nearest road, cell phone reception was poor, and the weather was beginning to turn bad. At first, everyone reacted differently. Our friend became angry and started blaming himself for being careless. Another friend became angry and started blaming him for being careless. Another became anxious and kept talking about all the things that could go wrong. The injured friend became embarrassed and frustrated with himself. I felt scared too. But after a few minutes, I realized my fear wasn't helping anybody. So I stopped focusing on how I felt and started focusing on what needed to happen. I checked the map, I rationed the water, I organised regular breaks, I helped support my injured friend during the long walk back and kept everyone's attention on the next step rather than the distance still ahead of us. The hike took almost 5 exhausting hours. By the time we reached the car park, everyone was tired, hungry and relieved. And a few days later, we met up for dinner. At one point, my injured friend looked across the table and he said, "When I got hurt, I honestly thought we were in serious trouble. Then you took charge. You kept everyone calm. I don't think we would have handled it nearly as well without you." The others agreed. I thanked them. What stayed with me wasn't the compliment. It was what had happened inside me on that mountain. For years, I had assumed becoming a man meant feeling confident, having everything figured out, or never being afraid. But when the situation became difficult, I was afraid, very afraid. The difference was that I acted anyway. I realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done despite feeling fear. Driving home that night, I kept thinking about the experience. The moment that changed me wasn't when my friends thanked me. It wasn't when we finally reached safety. It was the moment on the trail when I stopped asking myself, what if all this goes wrong? And I started asking, what needs to be done right now? The shift was small, but it changed everything. For the first time, I understood that manhood wasn't something that happened automatically with age. It wasn't a birthday. It wasn't a feeling. It was a choice. A choice to face reality instead of avoiding it. A choice to carry responsibility when others needed somebody to step forward. A choice to put the needs of the group ahead of my own comfort. Somewhere on that mountain track, without any ceremony, nobody watching, and no special recognition, I realized I had crossed an invisible line. I had stopped waiting to become a man, and I had started acting like one. It's a simple but incredible story. And this next one, this guy calls himself Jake, but I think that's a pseudonym. I don't think that's his real name. I always assumed becoming a man would feel dramatic. Maybe there would be some moment when I suddenly felt older, stronger, or more confident. Maybe people would start treating me differently. Maybe I would wake up one morning and simply know. But none of that happened. At 19, I still felt uncertain about a lot of things. I was working part-time, studying, trying to figure out what I wanted from life. And like many young men, I often wondered whether I was measuring up. Then one Friday evening, my father received a phone call. My grandfather had suffered a serious stroke. Within hours, my family was at the hospital. My mother was distressed, my younger sister was frightened, and my father was trying to hold everything together while dealing with his own emotions. As we sat in the waiting room, I noticed something. Everyone was looking to someone else for reassurance. Without really thinking about it, I stood up. I made phone calls to relatives. I organised food for my mother and my sister. I spoke with the nurses. When my sister became overwhelmed and started crying, I sat beside her and listened. For the next 3 days, I actually barely thought about myself. My attention was on what needed to be done and how I could support the people that I loved. Late on the third night, after my grandfather had stabilised, I stepped outside the hospital for some fresh air. My father followed me. He put a hand on my shoulder and he said to me, "You've been incredible through all of this. I don't know what we would have done without you." I thought that I would feel proud, but instead I felt something deeper. I realised that during the hardest days that my family had faced in years, nobody had asked me to step up. Nobody had given me permission. Nobody had told me it was time. I had simply seen a need and taken responsibility. At that moment, I understood something I had never understood before. Being a man wasn't about my age. It wasn't about muscles, money, confidence, or appearing tough. It was about willingly carrying responsibility when it would be easier to not do so. It was about remaining steady when others needed stability. It was about choosing service over self-concern. Standing outside the hospital, I realised that the feeling I had been waiting for all those years wasn't confidence. It was responsibility. And when I accepted responsibility, I knew that something had changed. For the first time in my life, I no longer felt like a boy wondering when manhood would arrive, because I realised that I had just stepped into it. Those were things that happened to these people quite unexpectedly, and yet they took responsibility, they took charge in a way they didn't before. And a similar thing happened to me. I was chasing girls, I was boozing, I was chasing girls, I was boozing. And one day when I was 24, I literally woke up and thought I'd better go and do something really concrete with my life. And I ended up going back to London where I was born, and I became a registered nurse, and I started my training. And we did the usual classroom piece. And when we'd covered enough theory, we went onto the wards. And I was totally shocked because I saw people really suffering for the first time. And I had no idea that people could be that sick, because when you're a young man, you think you're bulletproof. You think nothing's ever going to happen to you. But when I saw people really suffering, I was given responsibility for looking after them. For example, some people might come back from surgery and they needed to have their blood pressure done every 10 minutes, at least for the first half an hour, and then half an hour after that. And if their blood pressure dropped, that meant they were bleeding somewhere. You had to go and do something about that really quick. So people's lives were literally in my hands. And that was the first time I realised something outside of myself for a change, and started being responsible and started being of service to others. So maybe that's how you'll change into a man. Maybe it'll be some other way. I don't know. But I appreciate you watching this video. Please consider subscribing, because I am a new channel and I'm trying to help young men transition to manhood, especially if they're feeling lost or confused about things. I'm just trying to help them and keep them straight. And we'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. Thank you so much. I will see you next time.